So in 10th edition, a lot of the standard allies that you could have run before in Warhammer 40k are basically not going to be functional. But the other day, Games Workshop has given us a few clues as to the ones that remain. Let's talk about Imperial Agents and Allies in 40k, what we know so far from 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Warspec's Tactics, where it seems that 10th edition Warhammer 40k is phasing out the standard ally system that's been in the game for really quite a long time, and perhaps replacing it with something fairly similar to the Arcs of Omen Battle Brothers for just a few key armies. So far, Games Workshop hasn't given us a completely clear list of what can ally and what can't, though they have been fairly obvious that certain things just won't be able to combine in the main game. Let's talk about allies in 40k, the armies that are confirmed to be able to ally still, the ones that we don't know about yet, and their new chart for the Imperial Agents. First up, while this might feel like a change to the game for quite a lot of people, I feel like throughout the last 3 editions or so, allies have basically been slowly phased out in Warhammer 40k. Back in early editions, they were kind of rarish, and the trend tended to be more and more de-restrictive until we got into the very strange world of 7th edition. The allies matrix between different armies was very de-restrictive. You could even field competitive armies with 2 Come the Apocalypse allies, and you could have some very weird combos of things like Tyranids allying Space Marines if you really wanted to. I feel like it was a bit of a low point for cinematic 40k on the tournament scene at least. A lot of the best armies tended to be very weird combos of things like Tau Eldar or Space Marines. Kind of weird to see the Wraith Knights fighting alongside the Riptides. It didn't make for a very cohesive army look. Then in 8th edition, among many good changes to the game, Games Workshop tries to keep the focus a bit more on actual factions again, just having Imperium allying to each other, though at least initially you could have some fairly de-restrictive things like mixed characters within an Imperium detachment. St. Celestine was leading quite a lot of armies. That didn't really last too long though, as they basically stopped you from just using the Imperium keyword as a single detachment keyword. Things look like they made a lot more sense now. You'd have things like a detachment of Space Marines allied to a detachment or 2 of Imperial Guard. I feel like a lot of these just made a touch more sense when they had their own command structure in place, as opposed to just being mixed with random units. Then in 9th edition, they started to kind of stealth phase out allies. A fair few people were kind of tired to see quite so many soup armies around, and the way that Games Workshop tried to combat that was by giving you pure army buffs if you didn't run any allies, things like the Space Marines combat doctrines, and eventually just about every army got one of those, like the Death Guard contagions of Nurgle. I feel like that was quite a clever system, to be honest. It meant that you could still take any combination of allies that you could have before, but for the most time you wouldn't really want to, and it incentivized you to build around the actual codexes rather than a weird mishmash. For most of 9th edition, the secondary objectives were also restricted by the faction. Then throughout 9th we had a couple more changes. A chapter approved meant that you couldn't have mixed sub-faction allies, say for example Cadians allied with Cathchans for Imperial Guard. You couldn't double dip on the sub-faction bonuses like that, and say put some of your units in a shooting-centric sub-faction and some in a melee-centric one. And finally Arcs of Omen made it more restrictive than ever, at least in competitive tournament play, putting the nail in the coffin for most allies in the game. Things like most Imperial armies can't ally to each other, just a few named Battle Brothers within a specific section within that book. Things like Agents of the Imperium, Scions allied to Main Guard, and Leagues of Votan mercenaries for some reason, though this was only in match competitive play as opposed to just generally throughout 40k. It is kind of interesting, the gradual creep of making factions into pure armies again without mixing them, and now it seems to culminate in 10th edition taking that one step further. Allies in general just seem to be basically gone besides a few sanctioned exceptions. If anything, it seems like Arcs of Omen, but generalized to the rest of Warhammer 40k as well. So far for 10th edition, we've had a few little teasers as to how allies will work. One of the main things in the army building phase, saying that just in general, most armies won't generally be able to use them. Your armies are normally going to be drawn from just one codex and source, so you'll just have that one double-page spread of rules that they like going on about to represent your army's detachment rules, and you won't need more than one from multiple sources. They use the quote, "It's assumed that your force will be drawn from a single faction, barring a few notable exceptions." It does mean that now, within general 40k, common ally combinations just aren't going to be a thing for the most part, say Drukari and Craftwells working in tandem, Tyranids allying with Genestealer cults, though it sounds like the Genestealer cult will still get Brood Brothers, and other things like Adeptus Custodes with some auxiliary Scions or Guard, or other Imperial combos such as Marines and Sisters. Most of these weren't exactly optimal to do throughout the vast majority of 9th edition, though at least you could do it if you wanted to, up until the point of when you're playing Arcs of Omen tournament missions. I feel like removing allies like this probably has some positives and some negatives, depending on how much you like these mixed factions in the game. On the more positive side, it certainly means that you won't need multiple sources to make an army. Certainly in the past, if you did want to make a strong list, it was a bit weird and a bit annoying that maybe some of the very strongest lists could have been from, say, 3 different source books all crammed together. Not exactly the best for ease of access, and I feel like in general, people playing 40k would rather play against slightly more cohesive armies, things that look like they're supposed to be together, rather than 2 distinct forces that don't really share the same aesthetics. Again, drawing things just from one faction will generally make the force feel a bit more cohesive. I think it's also a bit easier for Games Workshop for game balance as well, rather than having to balance literally every single option in a super faction. They can just focus on making the codexes work, and while it might feel a bit restrictive for some, in more casual games people can just agree to be able to run 2 mixes of codexes. It might not lead to the most super balanced gaming experience ever, but that's probably not the biggest deal if you're just playing a casual game with your mates. For downsides, I certainly feel that there'll be a bit of feels bad from people who had built up themed allied forces. It's been part of the game for really quite a long time. Certainly has been gradually diminishing over the years, so I feel like a lot of people will have gradually adapted away from allies. But certainly Games Workshop themselves at one point touted things like their Allied Imperium way of building armies, having a lot of different factions that could potentially cross over and be run next to each other. I do feel that some of the combos are maybe fairly fluffy as well, that they're removing. Things like a few units of Grey Knights being attached to some Space Marines or some Guard to help them out against some demons seems perfectly in keeping with the lore. The same might be said of Adeptus Custodes potentially, or just Space Marines helping out an Imperial Guard defense force. I'd also argue that maybe there's not really that much need for a wholesale removal. I feel like the system that they had at the moment works kind of okay. All the armies are playable, but they're not optimal due to having a bonus when they're not run together. I think you could maybe make the argument and just say, yes, it's game legal to run them alongside each other, but you might lose one of those detachment rules, which are likely going to be quite powerful, and that's something that most people aren't going to want to do. Overall, I feel like there isn't going to be the biggest outcry against this. I feel like if they'd done this mid 8th edition or something, then it would have been a pretty major shake-up and might have ruined a bunch of people's armies. I feel like they might have slowly stepping stoned us to our way there by toning down the Allies' rules in multiple updates. It perhaps feels a bit less painful coming after Arcs of Omen than it would have done in the past. In general, I feel like it's not the worst thing in the world. Maybe going back to a time when 40k armies were a bit more individual and not just crossing over all over the place, and just focus on a few of the combos that make a bit more lore sense than some of the others. Talking of which, it does sound like the allies that are going to be present in 10th edition are going to quite strongly resemble that Battle Brothers section of the Arcs of Omen book, the list of specific examples that can take certain numbers of units. So far in their preview articles, Games Workshop have confirmed that a few things can ally in some form, those things being Agents of the Imperium, Imperial Knight Freeblades and Chaos Knight Dreadblades, Chaos Demons, which they referred to as Summon Demons, and Brood Brothers for Genestealer Cult. The Agents of the Imperium they've given us a little table for, which we'll get onto in a second. They say that the Freeblades and Dreadblades will be using a different sort of system to that. I don't know whether it'll be instead of the Agents or perhaps as well as. I guess you could still run a fairly mixed Imperial force if you're taking a Knight, an Assassin, and an Inquisitorial retinue or something, alongside whatever main faction you're taking. Otherwise though, there really is quite a lot of other things that are either from that table or part of current 9th edition. The Eldar ones haven't been mentioned yet, I don't think, things like the Harlequins and Corsairs. Both of these might just be rolled into generic Eldari units now, might not be any problems with the craft worlds. Maybe they'll get both keywords so you can either use them either in Drukhari or craft worlds. The Disciples of Be'lakor is another one, and that's already an army of renown, so seems to be in prime space to become a new detachment. Maybe that'll have a few restrictions and extra benefits that you can choose to mix up some demons and Chaos Space Marines perhaps. The Inari are an Eldar example of allied rules. They get some Craftworld units plus some Drukhari and Harlequins all mixed up. Again, maybe a detachment might be one of the better choices for that. I think Supreme Commanders could be an interesting one, whether they let units like Guilliman or Abaddon go across multiple things in their super faction. They did preserve that within Arcs of Omen, so you can still run Abaddon alongside other Chaos types if you want to. Again, I suppose that would be units from a different source. Might be kind of sensible to have them listed in the Allies section though. I guess they could potentially just be locked to their own chapter or legion. Finally, I suspect that the Allied Votan will probably be going away, seeing as they felt like an afterthought in Arcs of Omen to perhaps prod some sales. I feel like they're perhaps the least likely thing to be sustained in 10th edition. But who knows, Games Workshop might decide to preserve some mercenaries as an Imperial Allies option. I wouldn't hold my breath on that one though. Finally, we've got the Agents of the Imperium chart, perhaps the most concrete details that we have about any allies so far. Currently in Arcs of Omen, there's a couple of different ways that you can in theory run them in an Imperial army, either in an auxiliary support detachment or in an allied patrol. For some reason, Games Workshop still don't seem to have fixed the allied patrol rules, that they messed up with rules technicalities, but the intent did seem kind of clear to basically have Agents of the Imperium, HQ and troops, so a small amount within an army. These new rules seem kind of de-restrictive, and they seem to scale as per game size. They break down the units from the Imperial Agents into retinue units and character units, and it seems that their Incursion 1000 point games allow you one of each, the Strike Force 2000 point ones allow you two of each, and the Onslaught 3000 point ones allow you three of each. The characters will be things like Inquisitors, Rogue Traders, and Assassins, and the retinues I'm sure will be things like the Acolytes, Voidsmen at Arms, the Adeptus Arbites, and the Navy Breachers. With 40k's new character rules, I'm sure that the Assassins will be getting themselves lone operative, so they'll be fine on their own. It might well be that Inquisitors and things actually have to join a retinue. I feel like with those specific lists of units that they can join, I wouldn't be too surprised if they have to join things like an Acolyte unit, or Navy Breachers, or Arbites, as opposed to just really joining just about every single unit that the Imperium has to offer. I guess that's not guaranteed, they might be oddly de-restrictive and we get to see them leading Space Marines and Atomech into battle. I feel like 10th edition hasn't really been much about de-restrictive joining things and combos that might crop up that Games Workshop don't intend though. Depending on how it shakes out, if you want to include an Inquisitor, you might well need to include a retinue unit now. In general though, this does seem at least fairly de-restrictive to me. 2 characters and 2 squads out of the Imperial Agents seems really quite generous at 2000 points given current points cost. You could have around about a fifth or a quarter of your army in Imperial Agents if you really wanted to. They state that if you use them this way, you won't be able to make use of any detachment rules or enhancements. I guess that makes sense as they're basically coming in external to the detachment that you're running, and they won't get anything else in terms of detachments or things if they might happen to have them in their own army source. It means from their point of view that you can just literally add in the data cards and that's all the rules that you need for them, containing the full rules for things like the Assassins and the Inquisitors and everything like that. Overall seems like a pretty sensible system. I feel like with Games Workshop's current game design, I'd be surprised if any of these were too strong in game, to be honest. They have said in the past that they specifically look at units that are common to multiple factions, and they generally try and make sure that they're not too dominant and only a niche choice rather than something that literally everyone runs. I think that does make sense, to be honest. It just looks a bit weird when you've accidentally made one of the Inquisitors a bit OP or something, and suddenly every Imperium army at a tournament just happens to be running Inquisitor Kotias fighting against multiple copies of himself. So anyway, let me know your thoughts on standard allies being kind of gone, and the new rules that we've had revealed for the Agents of the Imperium. I'll certainly be interested to hear from anyone whose army it might mess up a bit. It does feel like this is actually quite a major step for some armies that might have existed for a fair amount of time all the way back to 7th. If you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to keep up with Games Workshop's news and releases, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, and I'll be sure to talk about any 10th edition rules that we get in the run-up to the release. Finally, if you've enjoyed the video and you've been finding them useful on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.